The final confrontation between the exiled King Charles II and General Oliver Cromwell was sealed not by steel, but by strategy. Cromwell was about to use Worcester's twin rivers, the Severn and the Team, to split his army and crush the king in a geographical trap. The year is 1651, and the English civil wars are supposedly over. King Charles I had been tried, executed, and consigned to history. The Parliament of England, led by the stern hand of Oliver Cromwell, had abolished the monarchy and declared a commonwealth. It was a new world, built on the ideals of republicanism and Puritan faith. Charles II, the young son of the dead king, was desperate to reclaim his birthright. He waited impatiently across the border in Scotland, allied with Covenanters whose loyalty was conditional. This uneasy alliance was fueled by mutual distrust, but united by a single, desperate goal: to tear down the Commonwealth. After Cromwell smashed the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar, Charles II saw his chance. He decided to invade England with the remaining 13,000 Scots soldiers, staking everything on the belief that Royalist England would rise up and flock to his banner. The invasion began with a lightning march in August. The Royalist army streamed south from Scotland, a wave of hope and fear rolling toward the heart of the Commonwealth. They bypassed the fortress cities and headed straight for London, trying to ignite a rebellion before Cromwell could react. But the expected uprising never came. England, battered by nearly a decade of civil war, was tired. The fear of another protracted conflict kept the common people in their homes, and the invasion stalled before it even reached a battle. But the king was marching toward a commander who had already calculated his every failed step. Meanwhile, the news reached Oliver Cromwell, the Lord General, a man who saw the war not as a political squabble, but as a righteous crusade. He viewed Charles II not as a lawful king, but as a wicked pretender, disrupting God's work on earth. Cromwell's reaction was immediate and terrifyingly decisive. He was not going to meet the Royalists head-on. He was going to outmarch and outmaneuver them, cutting off their path to London and trapping them in the west. Cromwell's new model army was the most formidable fighting force in Europe. It was a professional standing army, forged in the fires of discipline and religious zeal. These men were veterans, hardened by battles at Marston Moor and Naseby. They began a relentless pursuit, marching south with a speed that astonished their opponents. Day after day, Cromwell's forces narrowed the gap, transforming the Royalist invasion into a desperate, hurried retreat. The choice of where to make a stand fell to the Royalists. With London out of reach and Cromwell's army closing in, Charles II needed a secure base. He found it in the city of Worcester. It was a city with strong Royalist sympathies, fortified with ancient stone walls, and most importantly, far to the west of Cromwell's immediate advance. Charles II and his army marched into Worcester, ostensibly finding a refuge, but in reality, they had walked directly into a bottleneck. Cromwell quickly realized that the city's geography made it a perfect cage. He mobilized an enormous militia force, swelling his numbers to around 30,000 men. The trap was set. Cromwell's iron ring tightened around Worcester, pushing the Royalist forces against the city walls. This was the moment of truth for the exiled king. He could not retreat. He could not gather more strength, and he could not escape the reckoning that was closing in. The fate of the British Isles was now compressed into a single, walled city in the English countryside. But to secure this cage, Cromwell would have to commit the unthinkable, deliberately split his own superior force in two. The Royalists, with their roughly 13,000 men, prepared for a last stand. Their commander, General David Leslie, was deeply skeptical of the battle to come, having advised against the entire invasion. His Scottish army was low on morale and had little confidence in the local English royalists who had failed to appear. The battle would pit a demoralized and divided force against the peak of military professionalism. The contest would be determined not by the strength of Worcester's walls, but by the subtle and devastating geometry of the land itself. Cromwell knew the weaknesses of Worcester better than the king who sheltered within it. Its vulnerability was not in its stone, but in the lifeblood that flowed around it. It was here, at the heart of the kingdom, that Oliver Cromwell would execute his final, brutal masterpiece of generalship. He would transform the rivers that protected the city into the weapons that destroyed the king's cause. The young king had sought refuge behind stone, but he had failed to account for the water, the ultimate arbiter of Worcester's fate. The city was a prison, and Cromwell was about to use its very geography to spring the lock. Worcester, in 1651, was a city defined by water. It sat directly on the eastern bank of the massive River Severn, a grey artery flowing south through the Midlands of England. Crucially, just southwest of the city walls, the smaller, faster River Teme flowed east to join the Severn. This confluence meant the city was bordered by water on its west and southwest sides, creating a natural, seemingly robust defence. But to Oliver Cromwell, this geography was not a defence for the Royalists. It was a devastating flaw in their design. The rivers acted like a deadly pincer, and Charles II had placed his entire army between the blades. Cromwell's initial army, joined by militia forces he had rallied on the march, now numbered close to 30,000 men. The Royalist force inside Worcester stood at around 13,000. Cromwell had a nearly 3-to-1 advantage, but he had no intention of wasting lives in a costly, traditional siege against the city walls. His strategy was one of pure, brilliant maneuver. He would use the rivers to split his own larger army, bypass the frontal defences, and strike the Scottish army from 2 directions simultaneously, catching the Royalists in the open. His plan hinged on 2 daring river crossings. First, he had to cross the River Severn north of the city to place a substantial force on the western bank. Second, and most critical, he had to secure the Powick Bridge, which spanned the River Teme southwest of the city, and establish control over the entire tongue of land between the Teme and the Severn. This was the vulnerable underbelly of the Royalist position. If Cromwell could get forces across the Teme, they could strike from the south and west, where the king least expected it, while the main body of the new model army attacked from the east. The Royalist commanders saw the geographical threat, but failed to dedicate enough resources to the river crossings. Powick Bridge was the main focus of their defensive effort on the west, commanded by the capable but severely undermanned General James Massey. Massey desperately tried to hold the line with a few regiments, knowing that if Cromwell successfully forced the Teme, the game was over. However, Charles II and his advisors remained fixated on the eastern approach, treating the river crossings as a secondary threat. This was a fatal mistake. On the night of September 2nd, Cromwell began his preparations. His engineers worked under cover of darkness to prepare the vital crossings. He ordered a large detachment of his army, commanded by Major Generals Lambert and Fleetwood, to cross the Severn using a bridge of boats upstream from Worcester. This maneuver placed roughly half of the new model army on the western side of the Severn, effectively splitting Cromwell's overwhelming force, a staggering risk in front of the enemy. But Cromwell trusted his troops and his timing. This maneuver alone could have cost him the war, but the general knew his target was not the wall, but the bridge he had to shatter. The following morning, September 3rd, the air was thick with tension. Cromwell observed the scene from the eastern bank. The River Severn flowed fast and wide, and beyond it, the royalist defences seemed superficially strong. But Cromwell saw the weakness, the two rivers running parallel to each other, creating the perfect space for a double envelopment. He was not just fighting the king, he was fighting the land itself. His troops, seasoned and fiercely disciplined, were not fearful of the risk. They knew that their Lord General had brought them this far, and their faith, both in their cause and their commander, was absolute. Inside the city, the Scots and English royalists waited, uncertain and divided. They had seen the new model army grow on the opposite banks, their tents spreading like a stain across the fields. They knew they were trapped, and they prayed for an English uprising that would never come. Their only hope now rested on the thin line of men defending the few precious bridges that kept the river weapon from the torn inward. They knew the battle was coming, but they didn't know where Cromwell would strike first, or how swiftly the rivers would betray them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of three kingdoms. Cromwell's men stood ready on both sides of the Severn, waiting for the signal that would transform this tense standoff into the final, decisive bloodletting of the English civil wars. If you're captivated by the untold stories of leadership and sheer military grit, hit the subscribe button now and join us for the rest of this epic tale. The final showdown was about to begin, hinting at the ability of Cromwell's iron-willed troops to conquer not just men, but the cold, fast-flowing current of a river. At dawn, the sound of musket fire cracked the river mist. Cromwell's plan was a terrifying gamble: split the greatest army in England and send half of it across the fast-moving River Thames, right into the teeth of the enemy. The success of the entire campaign rested on the strength of a few pontoon bridges and the courage of the first men to cross. The decisive action of the day began not at the city walls, but a mile and a half southwest of Worcester, at the confluence of the Severn and the Thames. This land, known as Powys, was the key. Cromwell, positioned on the eastern bank, gave the signal to his lieutenants on the west, Generals Lambert and Fleetwood. Their mission was to force a crossing of the Thames, which meant overcoming the stout resistance of General Massey and his royalist troops defending Powys Bridge. Massey's men fought fiercely, knowing they were the last line of defense for the entire western flank. The bridge itself was a choke point, and the ensuing struggle was desperate and close quarters. Simultaneously, Cromwell's engineers quickly began constructing pontoon bridges downstream from Powys Bridge, allowing new model army regiments to bypass the bottleneck and stream across the Thames at multiple points. This construction under fire was a testament to the discipline of the new model army. They ignored the enemy shot and focused only on the task of building the pathway to victory. As Cromwell's forces established a foothold across the Thames, the royalist position crumbled. The resistance, though brave, was too localized and lacked the necessary reserves. Massey's men were steadily pushed back, their line dissolving under the synchronized, overwhelming pressure of the parliamentarian attack. By mid-morning, Lambert and Fleetwood had secured the western bank of the Thames, and the first pincer of the attack was successfully established. The parliamentary army was now positioned to strike the flank of the main royalist force. This success forced an immediate, frantic reaction from King Charles II inside Worcester. He was forced to watch the disaster unfold on the western bank of the Severn, the very river that now divided his main army from his collapsing flank. Seeing the danger of being caught between two converging forces, Charles II took a massive, desperate risk. He ordered a major portion of his main army to cross the Severn and hit the now established western wing of the new model army before they could turn and assault the city. This was the moment of ultimate commitment, a move of audacious aggression that could either save his crown or seal his ruin. The Royalist counterattack struck Lambert and Fleetwood's men hard. The fighting became intense, spreading across the fields west of the city. For a moment, the battle hung in the balance. Cromwell had divided his forces, and now Charles II was testing the strength of that division. If the western wing of the new model army broke, the king could potentially turn his attack east, shattering Cromwell's entire plan. The intensity of this engagement brought the whole world to a halt. For a terrifying hour, Charles II's desperate gamble actually worked. Cromwell's flank was broken, and the war was back on. It was here, amidst the carnage of battle, that the Lord General himself delivered his most crucial and inspiring act of generalship. The king's gamble had momentarily worked, turning the tables in a terrifying hour. But Cromwell's response was immediate and overwhelming, sealing the king's fate and transforming the battle into a massacre. The trap was sprung. Seeing his western forces collapsing, Charles II made his own reckless gamble, a massive, desperate charge across the Severn to hit Cromwell's headquarters on the eastern bank before the two parliamentary wings could unite. For a terrifying hour, it worked. Charles II personally led the charge, a desperate bid to win the war in a single afternoon. He drove his cavalry out of the city gates, crossed the Severn, and slammed into Cromwell's position on the eastern bank. The ferocity of this attack shocked the parliamentary reserves. They were pushed back, and for a short, agonizing period, the heart of the new model army was threatened. Cromwell's headquarters, his own life, and the future of the Commonwealth hung precariously in the balance. But Oliver Cromwell was not a general to be shaken. Seeing his line bend under the weight of the royalist assault, he acted with lightning speed. He rode back and forth, personally rallying his men, shouting encouragement, and moving reserves into the exact points of greatest danger. More importantly, he sent an urgent dispatch across the river, ordering reinforcements from his western wing to cross back to the eastern bank. The pontoon bridges, which had so brilliantly served to split the army hours earlier, now served as the lifeline for its reunification. The decisive moment came when the western wing of the new model army, having successfully forced the Tame, began to pour back across the river, hitting the royalist flank and rear. Charles II's counterattack, which had been so aggressive and powerful, suddenly found itself being struck by overwhelming force from three directions. The king's forces were caught in the open, pressed against the city walls, and crushed between the two massive parliamentary wings. The royalist army disintegrated into panic. The highly disciplined new model army began to press the attack toward the city walls, which were now severely undermanned due to Charles II's desperate offensive. The parliamentarians drove their enemies back, storming the city gates and pouring into the streets of Worcester. The fighting quickly became a rout, with royalist soldiers throwing down their weapons and attempting to flee. Cromwell, mounted and riding through the smoke and carnage, watched the final moments of the conflict. He saw the complete and total destruction of the royalist cause. Later, in his dispatch to Parliament, he would famously describe the victory as a crowning mercy, a moment where God himself had intervened to deliver the Commonwealth from its enemies. This was more than a battle won. It was the divine justification for the entire revolution. The victory was absolute, decisive, and bloody. Thousands of royalist soldiers were slain in the fighting or captured in the ensuing rout. The Battle of Worcester was over, and the English civil wars, the long, agonizing saga of bloodshed that had gripped the nations for nearly a decade, were finally, definitively finished. Yet, as the sun set over the carnage, the greatest prize of all was missing from the battlefield. The battle was over. The streets of Worcester choked with shattered regiments and discarded standards. But one prize was missing. As the Scottish army dissolved into a panicked rout, Charles II, stripped of his crown and his army, began a 40-day odyssey across England, a ghost fleeing the greatest manhunt in the country's history. The morning after the Battle of Worcester revealed the full scale of the catastrophe for the Royalist cause. 10,000 men were taken prisoner, many of them Scottish soldiers who were later sold into indentured servitude in the Caribbean colonies. The Royalist army was annihilated, its standards captured, its commanders imprisoned. The Commonwealth, now fully secured, had proven its military and spiritual superiority. The final threat to the English Republic had been removed, but Charles II, the young king who had led the charge, had vanished into the chaos. With a few loyal companions, he fled Worcester as soon as he realized the battle was irreversibly lost. This was the beginning of his legendary 6-week escape across hostile territory. Stripped of his royal identity, forced to cut his long hair and don the rough, dark clothes of a peasant, Charles II became a fugitive. He was hunted relentlessly by Cromwell's troops, who understood that as long as the king was free, the monarchy remained a threat. The escape itself became the stuff of legend. The most famous incident occurred shortly after the battle, when Charles II spent a terrifying day concealed in the thick branches of an oak tree at Boscobel, while new model army soldiers searched the ground below. He subsisted on the kindness of loyal subjects, dodging patrols and relying on luck, loyalty, and sheer nerve. His journey was a profound, humbling contrast to his grand ambitions, transforming a pampered king into a survivor. The political fallout was immediate. With the destruction of the Royalist army at Worcester, Oliver Cromwell became the undisputed military and political master of Britain. The battle was the final, definitive statement on the future of the English monarchy. Cromwell's vision of a Protestant republic, a commonwealth, was realized, cemented by what he termed that crowning mercy. The Battle of Worcester was not merely a victory, it was an act of political finality. It was a masterpiece of maneuver, where Cromwell transformed rivers into the ultimate weapons of war, forcing 2 desperate crossings to secure a victory so absolute it sent a king into hiding for 10 long years. Don't let history's most critical turning points fade into the past. Subscribe now to our channel to make sure you catch all the detailed cinematic history we bring to life. What was the most decisive battle in history? Tell us in the comments below and let us know what story you want to see next. And if you think a friend would love to learn how a general used twin river crossings to crush a king's dreams, please share this video with them.